Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am especially happy to be presenting on this topic today at this joint conference with the theme of connections, because I'm looking to make connections across something of a gulf. As an academic with a foot, no real pun intended, in both the Bigfoot research community and that of parapsychology, I see a divide between researchers in the two fields. And the divide seems to follow the occupational lenses that investigators bring to their work. Scientifically minded Sasquatch investigators tend towards exclusively biological theories, to the extent of virtually ignoring any aspects of witnesses' personal subjective experiences beyond those relevant to determining whether or not a report is credible. The options here are generally that a given report is factual, misidentification, fabrication, or that its credibility can't be determined. Among amateur Bigfoot investigators and enthusiasts, there are two basic positions. The flesh and blood camp, who hold to natural biological and evolutionary ideas of some sort of unknown North American primate, and the woo, as in woo, those who are somewhat out there, those whose theories include supernormal or supernatural elements, including that Bigfoots are interdimensional beings, that they're extraterrestrials associated with UFOs, that they possess extensive psi abilities, that they are the biblical Nephilim, the ancient offspring of angels and human women, or that they are tulpa-like creations of individuals or group consciousness. Within the Bigfoot community, it should be noted, the term paranormal is used only to refer to this latter group and their ideas. Still, the notion of an extant, undiscovered hominid is hardly considered normal by mainstream science, nor by Americans overall. You usually find Bigfoot titles in the same section of the bookstore as UFOs, psi, witchcraft, and parapsychology. While Sasquatch is considered outside the bounds of parapsychology by most psi proponents, I find that many presume that its ultimate explanation lies through their own occupational lens. In other words, that Bigfoot encounters are a similar sort of personal, subjective experience as are apparitions, poltergeist, or other manifestations of psi. Psi proponents, oftentimes natively skeptical of materialist science, may view normal biological approaches to the study of any paranormal unknown as naive. Most certainly, too, I suspect that, steeped as American culture is in the rhetoric of the skeptical movement, that Bigfoot researchers and parapsychologists almost reflexively look at one another's field as lacking in evidence or even laughable. We may be viewed as crazy, each might say, but at least we're not those people. Apart from the sheer cultural issues, communication across this gulf is so difficult because of the very different evidentiary practices on either side. Even when psi and normal theories of Sasquatch are seriously co-considered, it has thus far inevitably been pretty much of a thought exercise rather than a testable model. For example, Joshua Cutchin's recent article in Edge Science looks at Bigfoot through the lens of poltergeist phenomena. It presents interesting speculation as to possibilities in this area, but it really fails to move beyond speculation. Now, while today I'm not presenting a formal study or findings, I do hope to move past mere speculation towards testability by sharing some observations and especially some ways of perhaps determining which claimed Bigfoot cases might be more profitably explored by means of an RSPK hypothesis. Setting aside cases appropriately explainable by normal hypotheses of hoaxing or misinterpretation, I think it's first of all important to be clear that any psi hypothesis is highly unlikely to explain the full Sasquatch phenomenon. Contrary to the claims of ideological skeptics, Sasquatch evidence is far more than just eyewitness accounts. And eyewitness accounts as a corpus are generally quite consistent, both internally and with known primate behavior. Occam's razor clearly favors hypothesizing a possible undiscovered North American primate. Certainly, countless case studies support the idea of psi or RSPK producing not just physical effects, but even manifesting matter through apports and the like. So why wouldn't these explain Sasquatch footprints and trackways, alleged Sasquatch hair, sebum prints, and other alleged physical evidence? Simply put, because the level of super psi required to produce the extant evidence seems unreasonable. Just to consider the footprint casts. The more credible examples of these share common features that are distinct from the database of known animals. As noted by anthropologists Grover Krantz and Jeff Meldrum, they exhibit common traits consistent with the morphology and physiology of an hypothesized primate's foot, traits that would generally not be known by a non-specialist. Furthermore, while the presence of dermal ridges was only noted in the early 1980s in alleged track cast, these were also seen upon reanalysis of many casts from earlier decades. If there are documented cases of apports of genuine coins or newspapers with future dates, I hope somebody will let me know. Beyond just the physical evidence, the nature of eyewitness accounts of Sasquatch generally reflect what seem to be biological creatures. Reports in North America have a centuries-old history predating European colonization. They share very similar physical and behavioral descriptions, and reported behaviors closely reflect the documented behaviors of known primates in other parts of the world. Rock throwing, for example, has been a common feature of many Bigfoot reports, even prior to being documented scientifically as a behavior of known non-human primate species. So if I think that the most likely paranormal hypothesis by which Sasquatch phenomena should be tested is biological and natural, then why am I speaking today about poltergeists? Because I don't think that a biological hypothesis explains all of reported Bigfoot experiences. On the one hand, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the vast majority of Bigfoot reports had normal explanations, rooted in fraud, misidentification, or pareidolia. Yet at the same time, I like to err on the side of believing witnesses, at least in the sense of believing in their subjective experiences, if not always in their interpretations of those experiences. As someone also interested in potential psi phenomena, I don't want to dismiss the small yet significant sliver of reports that include phenomena often of interest to parapsychologists. These include the perceived co-occurrence of Bigfoot encounters and anomalous lights or UAPs, reports of Sasquatch as apparition-like figures that are perceived to vanish in plain sight, and reports of Bigfoot mind-speaking to witnesses. This latter is usually described as a perceived voice in the witness's head that they insist is not their own, generally either directing the witness where to look to see a Bigfoot, or perhaps most commonly, directing them to flee upon seeing a Bigfoot. While you can probably easily hypothesize psi potentially operating in any of these scenarios, each presents particular problems in terms of parsing out what might be happening, as indeed any of these might be mixed scenarios, where a perceived or actual Bigfoot encounter triggered or was triggered by a psi experience. I always caution my students when using scientific techniques to study the paranormal to heed the advice from Ghostbusters and don't cross the streams. In other words, while phenomena might indeed have mixed or complex explanations, understanding them scientifically must proceed in a controlled way, generally one hypothesis at a time. So for example, while there could be an unknown North American primate species that exhibits strong psi abilities, scientific inquiry needs to follow a logical path of hypotheses. Say, prove first that an unknown species exists, then perhaps its capacity for psi might be assessed. However, as it's been percolating in my brain for years now, there is a place to look for psi effects now, and that is in the potential RSPK of living human agents in select reported encounters. While a formal phenomenological study would be in order, I've noted several features of some alleged reports, both documented and reports that I've heard firsthand, that seem to fit an RSPK pattern rather than that of a biological creature, especially as these features seem to co-occur. Tossing of pebbles. While this is not completely unheard of among known primate species, it is exceedingly rare. Rocks are generally documented and reported as thrown for intimidation purposes, and the tossing of tiny pebbles is not terribly intimidating. On the other hand, RSPK effects often tend towards smaller and opportunistic objects. Return of rock throws. While seemingly not common at all in these reports, some witnesses do report that they threw rocks back and forth with an unseen Bigfoot. This seems to me reminiscent of the Cardiff Poltergeist case documented by David Fontana, as well as the Nottingham stone thrower documented by Tony Cornell. These are just two cases that I'm aware of, and I guess that there likely are more that involve the two-way tossing of stones. A Class B report. In amateur Bigfoot researcher lingo, this refers to an alleged encounter where the Bigfoot is not actually seen, only heard, or its alleged effects are seen. In poltergeist experiences too, effects are generally witnessed rather than causes. Intentionality. Experience are not only certain believers in Bigfoot, but actively seeking encounters, often through prayer or thoughtful intention. Most Bigfoot encounters are reported by people engaged in other activities. Intention in RSPK cases tends to be subconscious, but again is vital to the events reported. Extreme frequency. Experience are involved who frequently or even almost always report experiences when seeking them. Similarly, poltergeist phenomena are ongoing, at least during the period of subconscious intention. Non-credible locations. These experiences are often associated with areas that would seem unlikely habitat for a natural species. For example, well-populated suburbs, very small state parks, a friend's living room, or immediately adjacent to the venue of a current Bigfoot conference, by which I mean, of course, a conference about Bigfoot, not a conference of Bigfoot creatures. One experience told me that he might have an experience at night in a 1 or 2 acre patch of trees adjacent to a hotel. RSPK follows agents rather than places. An initial encounter that seems much more credible. Many of these experiences have a very different first encounter story, where they describe a spontaneous and much more biologically, locationally, geographically credible precedent experience. Some will have the sense that something followed them home, or will thereafter seek out further experiences, which tend to then fit the patterns that I'm noting here. If RSPK or even conscious PK underlies these experiences, it's not difficult to imagine a real Bigfoot encounter, at least an encounter perceived as real, as an event or even trauma that precipitates subsequent psi experiences. Encounter reports that hold most or all of these features tend to be ignored by most scientifically minded Sasquatch researchers, the biologically oriented ones, as perhaps they should, because they fit neither the standard range of reports nor a biologically plausible theory. But their strong fit to the range and models of poltergeist phenomena lead me to think that this way of parsing out what are more likely to be psi-related reports, offers a place for parapsychologists to investigate. For parapsychologists, these individuals' ongoing experience of paranormal phenomena offer the chance to investigate in much less ad hoc or opportunistic ways than the typically short-term poltergeist case. Thank you.
Thank you, Darby. Boy, I was hoping you weren't finished. I was really getting into it. It was really interesting. So, Darby, have you had a Bigfoot encounter? What brought you into this? What made you want to study this?
Well, John, I think you know the origins of my course, but my interest in teaching this course. But very briefly, I was involved quite a few years ago in helping to put together a team for an invited DARPA proposal that, let's just say, bordered on the parapsychological. Really, it was very close. And it got me really interested in this question of, what sorts of questions are allowed in mainstream science? What sorts of questions are outside of the veil? Why? Really wondering about the culture and the philosophy and the practices of science from that perspective. And so that was where I conceived of my course. And as I was looking around for areas, certainly I was aware of parapsychology. I was aware of Bigfoot. I started looking into these areas, and that was when I really just went down that rabbit hole and became a little bit engaged with these communities in terms of seeing what was going on. What were the sorts of scientific tools and scientific thinking that they were applying? And here's where I am today, with a foot in both of these communities, as well as continuing in traditional science.
So, okay, you're avoiding the question. I want to ask you.
Oh, have I? Well, I have. Let me put it this way. In just a few years, by going out into the field and shadowing investigators of all kinds and seeing what's going on, I have seen some things, certainly, and I've experienced some things that are consistent with a Sasquatch hypothesis. I wouldn't say that I'm certain that what I encountered was that, including probably the strongest evidence that I encountered was that I actually found a pair of apparent trackways in the woods in eastern Kentucky. And so that's I've seen enough now to continue to keep my curiosity at a pretty high level.
Very cool. So lots of compliments for your presentation. Lots of them are coming through the chat. There's literature out there that relates Bigfoot and alien phenomena. And people sometimes say that perhaps it's a cross-dimensional being that comes into appearance and then leaves. I wonder if you had any thoughts about this and if you've encountered that. If you've encountered people who believe that, I should say.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There are quite a few of them in the so-called Bigfoot community. And yeah, I've met many of them, and the problems that I have with those theories is that they are using an unknown to explain another unknown. I haven't seen a particularly coherent and especially testable or evidence-based theory of that, other than people other than people just relying on that sliver of reports to say that's what's going on. Now, that doesn't mean that that's not what's going on there. It's just that I think it would be premature to think that.
So we in our field we often talk about the sheep goat effect and how much of a role belief can play. Do you think that the lack of belief, being a strong goat, could prevent people from having these sorts of experiences?
Uh, it's the interesting thing about that. I hadn't really thought about the sheep goat effect with regard to this topic, but now that I've been asked, I think there are probably two ways that it comes in. One is that I think that there are probably folks who wouldn't, if whatever however we define a genuine experience, they might not even notice it, or they might not even perceive that experience, if this wasn't on their radar at all. And I think that's probably the if you've ever seen that psychology experiment where they're dribbling basketballs and they tell you to count the basketballs, and then at some point a gorilla comes and walks through the video and dances around and leaves, and most people never see the gorilla. So that sort of thing could be going on all the time. I do think that in the cases that to my mind seem to fit the RSPK hypothesis much more strongly, I absolutely think that that's what's going on. Some of these folks, wow, I mean, literally, they can, every time they go out in any woods, anywhere, they will have an experience. They will report an experience. And some of these experiences seem to be shared. The pebbles being thrown, it's not just one person going out and saying this happened. It's, two or three people investigating together who experienced this. So I imagine that's got to be going on in these, more RSPK-ish cases.
So is it the pebbles that really had you start looking into the RSPK, or what was the key thing that kind of made you decide that might be a phenomenon to explore?
Well, it was the pebbles, because the pebbles were the first observable piece of the story that reported by multiple people. And so that led me to believe, there's probably something, unless all those people are lying about it, there's probably something going on, or a hoax situation or what have you. There's something objective going on. It's not just an internal experience at that point.
Really interesting perspective you're taking on this. Going back to the Sasquatch legends, do you know what period they originated from? The North American legends of Sasquatch?
I mean, they go back well before European colonization. So there are tribal stories going back, who knows, thousands of years. There is a possible account of Sasquatch encounters found in the Vinland Saga, which is the Vikings' record of their travels in North America. So I mean, they go way back.
And Teddy Roosevelt, didn't he encounter a Sasquatch?
Teddy Roosevelt did not encounter a Sasquatch, but he reported secondhand a story that he had heard from a trapper who shared that story.
And that's just to show you how the stories change through time, isn't it? So, of course, there's never been any physical remains found of Sasquatch. So, from your perspective, that's not a surprise, is it?
Well, on the one hand, I would say, I mean, there hasn't been a body, certainly that's been brought brought forward. There are some, there is some physical evidence. And that's actually something that I'm also working on getting together. I've been in the process of putting together a really interesting team of scientists to really truly evaluate what scant physical evidence there is. I gotta say, I mean, the lack of a body ever is somewhat problematic to the hypothesis on the one hand, but on the other, if you're talking about a very rare, very elusive, and likely the most intelligent North American mammal apart from perhaps Homo sapiens, I don't know. I mean, yes, it's a problem. It's a problem, but on the other hand, you have to look at the evidence that there is, and there aren't real elegant ways to explain away the best evidence.
Well, it's been really interesting, and I think your perspective is pretty unique in this regards.